Well, hi. Since I have, too much free time on my hands at the moment, I decided to record sort of a follow up video to the one I did yesterday about learning from your own games. And this game that I'm going to show today is an older game than the previous one. And I think I've actually shared it before, but I think it's sort of interesting to look at it in the context of the game from the last video because a lot of the same problems in my play that showed up in the game from part one sort of were already present. This game was played. This game was played in September of 2018, and it sort of shows that I haven't rectified these problems in my play really. So, anyways, this game was play. This was played in the fourth round of a tournament. I was on 2.5 out of 3, and if I'd won or drawn, that would have probably put me in pretty good stead for a prize. And I'd beaten a no wait, what happened? I'd beaten a FIDE master in the second round, and in this game I was paired against another FIDE master, rated 2400 plus, possibly soon to be international master. I don't know. But, okay, anyway, so I played e4. I had the white pieces in this game, e4, c5, knight f3, e6. And right off the bat, at the time, this was sort of a hole in my repertoire because for a long period of time, I was playing bishop b5 Sicilians, and against e6, I was playing d3 and going for some sort of King's Indian attack where black's already committed to e6, which is possible, but arguably not ideal. And I played this from like 2015 until about probably 2017. But eventually I decided I wasn't satisfied with it. And I decided, okay, I'm going to learn. And I wanted to stop playing bishop b5 Sicilian as well anyway. So I decided, okay, I'm going to learn the open Sicilian. But yeah, I by this point in time, I hadn't really gotten around to it. And after e6, I mean, I wasn't sure what to do. Like, I'm not a huge fan of this d3 move anymore. So I played c3, which is, yeah. A c3 Sicilian, which, okay, the c3 Sicilian not meant to be the most exciting of openings, but the argument is with black committed to e6, you get to avoid lines where the bishop can come out to g4, and so black's maybe a little bit less possibility for activity, and maybe that helps white a little bit. Because, yeah, I wasn't really prepared to go into the open Sicilian, which I would have liked to do. Now, since this game was played, this part I actually have rectified. I've done some work on the open Sicilian. I would be prepared to play d4 in this position today, most likely. And I have played d4 in this position in a tournament game since this game was played. But anyway, c3, black played d5. The other option would be to play knight f6, and you would get something after e5, knight d5. This is a big main line. White plays d4 usually. Black will take and play d6 at some stage, knight c6, and so forth. But okay. Black played d5 in this game. I played e takes d5. You could probably also play e5 and try to transpose into an advanced French, but I don't play the advanced French with white. So I took on d5, and he played queen takes d5. And, the other major options play ed, which leads to positions more reminiscent of a French Tash, but he played queen takes d5, and this is another big main line of the c3 Sicilian, in as much as a big main line exists in the c3 Sicilian. This line was, after knight f6, made famous, if I remember correctly, by the first game of the Deep Blue Kasparov match, the first one in '96, where Deep Blue won with white in the first game, but went on to lose the match. I don't remember how that game went. I think maybe just bishop e2 or knight i3, I can't remember. But in the game I played a3. And this is, it looks like a silly move. But this is kind of one of the drawbacks of, not really having a proper repertoire, which I didn't really against the Sicilian at this point in time, is you just play ideas you sort of half remember, having looked at being interesting half a decade ago. This a3 move is kind of interesting, but yeah, having looked at it in more detail after the game, I don't think it's very good. But the point basically is that in some lines, you're trying to stop black from playing c takes d4, c takes d4, and bishop b4 check, and simplifying the position. So for example, one of the main lines in this position is bishop e3, when a big option for black here, and one of the dissuading factors against this move order with 6 bishop e3 is for black to take, play bishop b4 check. Knight c3 is the most sensible move. Castles, bishop d3, and now b6. White castles, and now the simplifying maneuver. Bishop takes c3, b takes c3, bishop a6. So giving up the bishop pair, but straight away aiming to swap one of them off. Bishop takes a6, knight takes a6. And now in a relatively simplified position, white's got these hanging pawns. It's got some activity. Normally they play queen a4 and try to play c4, but black should be fine here. So the idea of a3 is to just sort of stop. A3 is a useful move in these sorts of upcoming IQP positions in general, but it just is to try to keep as many pieces on the board as possible in the IQP structure. Knight c6, bishop e3, and yeah, there's sort of an interesting, I guess, psychological point here in that generally in the c3 Sicilian, most of the time, bishop e3 is the cue for black to take on d4, because at some point white is going to be threatening to play d takes c5, and then if bishop takes c5, you trade queens and win a piece. And if queen d1, king d1, white is a pawn up at the end of the line. But because of the fact that white is spent to move on a3, it turns out that actually the threat, quote-unquote, to take this pawn on c5 is actually more illusory than genuine in this case. But the automatic reaction to bishop e3 is to play cd4. So that's what he played, cd4. Well, actually, this is what he told me after the game is that, what was it? That he knew that it's possible to avoid taking on d4 and setting up with something like bishop e7 and b6, but he told me something to the effect of he was worried I might try to take on c5, and he just wanted to play an IQP position and try to outplay me, which he did, so fair enough. But bishop e7, I think, is a very strong argument against playing this line with a3, because if black just refuses to take on d4, it all looks a little bit silly. Because after cd4, white's knight is free to go to c3 and attack the queen and hop into an active square. If the knight can't go to c3, like I said, this all looks a little bit silly. For example, yeah, if bishop d3, you can just castle, play rook d8, play b6, bishop b7, and black should be fine. And I don't quite see the point of white's position in that case. And if you take on c5, which must be critical, after queen d1, king d1, knight g4, white can play the move b4. And I think here the computer wanted a5. And yeah, black should be okay here. White's got this nice pawn mass and an extra pawn, but it's under a lot of fire, and knight takes e3 is likely to happen at some point, and black has good compensation. When you can also go bishop e2 with white, but then black can, if he wants, trade these pawns, and then this makes a little less sense for white because the bishop would want to go to d3 and not e2 in general. So anyways, that I think is the way to play against this a3 line for black. But anyway, he took on d4, cd4. Now the knight gets to go to c3. And, well, actually the problem for white is black has been a little bit compliant to even allow white to get this position. But even still, it's not really better for white. So anyways, play over the next few moves continued very naturally. Bishop e7, preparing to castle and getting the bishop out. Knight c3, the queen goes to d6. You can also go to d8. You can probably go to a5 as well, but d6 makes a lot of sense for the queen because you can, at some stage, for example, bring a rook to d8, and you've got pressure going against the d4 pawn. Bishop d3, short castles, b6. Yeah. A3 wasn't a particularly common move order, but now the position we've reached has been played a decent amount of times. And the A3 move is not purposeless because it stops black from being able to play knight b4, hitting the bishop, and then dropping the knight back to d5. And in IQP positions, the square in front of the isolated queen's pawn is generally quite hotly contested and is often a pivotal battleground in the middle games. So anyways, I played rook c1, which is not the most common move, but usually they go queen e2. But okay, it's not really a concrete variation sort of position. It's just you bring your pieces out. Although you can make the case that maybe this rook wants to be on d1 rather than c1. So I played rook c1. He played bishop b7. I played bishop b1, preparing, for example, to put the queen on this diagonal. And start hinting at some threats here, and then putting the rook on d1, perhaps. And again, I'm still not 100% sure about the right setup for the rooks in this variation, because you can put the rooks on c1 and d1, or you can put the rooks on d1 and e1, for example. I guess even e1 and c1 is possible as well, and I'm never really 100% sure where the rooks should go. I think one of them's got to be on d1, especially with black's queen on d6. I think this makes a lot of sense, and also with the idea of carrying out d5, you would like your rook on this square. He plays rook fd8, and I played queen c2. Yeah, queen c2 is a strange move. Queen d3 looks more natural, and I suspect this is probably what I was intending to play when I went bishop b1. I don't remember 100% what my reasoning was for playing queen c2 and not queen d3. And this is, I mentioned in the last video, the importance of transcribing some of your thoughts after the game. And it really would be helpful to know why I didn't play the more natural queen d3. And looking in the database, queen d3 has been played by some decent players. And only one guy went queen c2 here. I don't know. I guess I was worried about leaving my queen on the same file as this rook. Maybe I wanted my rook on my f-rook on d1 to be unopposed, or to be unblocked towards the black queen, rather than just having the queen out of the way. I don't know. But I think queen d2 is a good move. One game here continued rook a8, rook fd1, and g6. Bishop a2 and bishop f8. This kind of standard play for this line. Black blunts this battery here to avoid, anything happening there. And the dark squares are a bit weak, so he transfers the bishop around. Meanwhile, this bishop isn't really gainfully employed on this diagonal anymore because it's blocked by this f7, g6, h7 group. So it switches to this diagonal, where it can do stuff here, have influence here, and can fight for the d5 square and maybe support the d5 break at some stage. So anyway, I went queen c2, which, I don't like queen c2. Especially considering if the idea is to keep it off this rook's file, you're stepping onto this rook's file. So that explanation doesn't make sense. So I don't think that was the genuine explanation. I don't know. He goes rook ac8. Maybe I was worried about, like, after g6, knight d5, knight f4, or something hitting the queen. I have no idea. Rook fd1. G6. So everybody's got all their pieces into play. And now it's, time to figure out what to do. And first of all, at some stage, now with the rook on d1, with the bishop and queen lined up towards h7, I think this is the first moment when d5 might genuinely be a threat. And the point is that the knight is tied to the defense of h7. So the knight's coverage of d5 is sort of illusory at this point in time. So the threat's probably like d5, e5, and I guess knight d5. And that looks quite scary, doesn't it? So, okay, g6, good move. Blunting these pieces here. There's one game in the Lichess database here, and in that game, someone called Ricardo Guecci played queen e2, which looks like a sensible move, because this stuff over here isn't doing much anymore, and you're getting the queen off of the file of the rook. Sure. Anyway, I played bishop a2 with a similar sort of idea because this bishop doesn't do much over here anymore, and so I switched it to a2. These ideas in mind, and there are also potential sacrifices against one of these points. This is another, actually, positive use of the move a2 to a3, is it frees this square for the bishop. So, okay. And black played knight i5. And I recall around this point in time, this is where I started to feel a bit uncomfortable putting my queen on c2 rather than d3, and I felt a little bit silly about that choice because, the rook is now more so unveiled towards the queen than it was even before, and there's an idea of knight d5 when this knight is pinned here. Knight c4 is an idea, but knight d5, if allowed, might, make white feel a bit silly about himself because, I assume you'd like to meet this with knight e4, but it's pinned at the moment. And there's this idea of taking and grabbing the pawn on a3, if not just simplifying the position a little bit more. And there's also bishop takes f3 to consider. So I solved several of these problems at once. I played queen to e2, which covers the potential threat on f3. It gets the queen off the file of the rook. It covers the c4 square. And yeah. And again, the queen wasn't doing much on this diagonal anyways. I gave another line here. I said if knight e5 is played, black will play knight d5. That looks about right to me. So queen e2, knight d5, knight e5, knight takes c3, b takes c3. Okay. So this is kind of an interesting position because, well, it's possible to play queen takes a3. I don't think I actually had a clear idea of what specifically I was going to play if queen takes a3 was played, but it just seemed too risky for black to be able to get away with it, which is probably not... Like, you'd like to have something specific in mind, but in this case, I think I maybe agree with that mindset because it just looks so perilous for black after queen takes a3 because the queen's offside and you've got all these pieces pointing towards the black king. I think I was intending bishop h6, which looks like a good move to me. And the computer confirms that white's doing quite well here. It does look a little bit vague, but again, the queen is over here. The dark squares are kind of weak. Straight away, the threat, I assume, is knight takes f7, king takes f7, something takes e6 check, probably the queen, and followed by devastation somewhere. And yeah, the computer says white's got a big plus here. Sure, fair enough, I think. Everything's quite weak. There's also this idea of, I guess, knight g4, with at some stage the idea of supporting with the queen somehow and hopping into f6, or even playing queen e5 and just trying to, bluntly impale black on the dark squares, as well as sacrifices on e6, in addition to the sacrifices on f7 should be possible. Bishop f6 is also an okay move, but in the game you play knight c6, which makes sense. Well, black's just trying to... The knight on a5 is not really going to c4 anymore, so he's just hopping back and trying to trade off white's invasive knight on e5. And at this point I came up with an idea. And it's sort of a cool idea, and I got really interested in finding out whether it worked or not. So I started calculating it, and I spent quite a long time. And this is sort of the familiar theme from the previous game. In the previous game, first of all, in the opening, I spent longer than I needed because I got overly interested in the position. And then later on, I was trying to calculate all these forcing lines and spending all my time, and they ended up not working anyways. This time it's a little bit different because, well, if this shot works and it wins the game, well, then the time you spent is well spent. If it doesn't win the game, and, well, if it gives you an advantage, you can argue it's well spent, depending on how much time you in fact use on it. Whereas if it doesn't work, that time's wasted, but yeah, you could argue it's good to check it anyways. In this case, yeah, I don't remember exactly how long, but probably at least half an hour thinking about the idea. It works, sort of, in that it probably gives white a small advantage, but at the end of the day, my opponent just ended up avoiding all of the sharp lines I'd calculated and just bailing out into a slightly worse position and arguing, okay, I'm not in danger here. You've just wasted all your time calculating a bunch of sharp lines, and I'm not even going to deal with that. And you get to sit there. You've got a small advantage, but you've got less clock time than me. I'm still the stronger player, and now I'm going to outplay you from this position. So anyways, knight takes f7. Once I noticed this possibility, I couldn't really convince myself to pass it up, even though it doesn't really lead to that much for white. Once I saw that it was possible, I just couldn't resist. Actually, there's a much simpler move that I sort of barely considered because I was too fixated on this knight takes f7 possibility. And my opponent said after the game that he thought it was just a much simpler way to get an advantage, and that was knight g4. Avoiding the trade of knights and hoping to hop into a dark square somewhere. Yeah, fair enough. I think this looks like a reasonable move. The computer wants to play h5 in reply, and I think I remember at the board not entirely understanding. For the brief amount of time I did look at knight g4, after h5, I didn't really understand what I was meant to be doing here. Like, you can hop into h6, and after king g7, play something like d5, takes, with some attacking potential, but the computer points out that black can actually probably just take this. And after rook d5, white's up material, but the knight's stuck on h6. Unclear. I have no idea how to assess this position. But anyway, it's something that, you should spend some of your time thinking about rather than spending all your time thinking about knight takes f7. Oh, by the way, there's one other line. After knight g4, h5, I also gave d5 here, but it does straight away, but it doesn't work. After hg4, de6, looks exciting, but after queen a3, ef7, king g7, it just doesn't work because white doesn't really have a next move, and the attack just sort of ends and white's down a piece. So anyways, knight f7. What's the idea? After king takes f7, my follow-up was d5. This is the point, because everything's lined up in such a way that black has to either return the piece or come forward with his king. And some of the long lines that I was calculating. Okay, first of all, the knight's hit. If you move it, then d takes e6 check is the other threat, and you pick up the queen. Therefore, the obvious moves are either to dip the queen off the file and let white take the knight back, move the king away and let white take the knight back, or the critical move has to be e takes d5. And e takes d5 was the move I spent the majority of my time calculating because it's the most interesting and it's, I guess, critical. E takes d5, rook takes d5, queen takes d5. And now, important, because if you play bishop takes d5, rook takes d5, say queen f3 check, black can block with the rook. And the material count is that black's got a rook and a couple pieces for a queen and a pawn. So that's good for black. But the key move here is queen f3 check, which is sort of reminiscent of the fried liver, because this queen is pinned on d5. And my opponent told me after the game, I think, that he missed this idea, but also he didn't really spend much time calculating this line because he just wasn't interested in all of these risky complications. For example, king e6, queen h3 check, king f6. This is just one sample line. Bishop takes d5, rook takes d5, and queen takes h7. And I remember I'd seen to this point during the game, and I decided, well, it's unclear, but it could be fun to play. Against a higher rated player, it's often a good strategy to confuse the issue. And this looked confusing. Black's up material, but his king is incredibly unsafe. But if you run this on a computer, it actually says that white's winning. So yeah, instead of e takes c5, he very quickly played queen e5, which is a move I'd barely considered, if at all, because I figured, well, if I get to take the piece back, this was worth it. But it's not even all that clear. And yeah, like I said earlier, I've now sort of wasted a lot of time thinking about complications that really, in my opponent's mind, had no chance of actually occurring on the board because he was just going to avoid it. And my position, in return for all of this time spent, my position hasn't even objectively improved by doing this. So d6 doesn't accomplish anything anymore. In particular, black just moves the king away. So white's got to retake the piece. Bishop takes c6, and now f4. And here black should probably put the queen on either e4 or f5. It's still an interesting position. The king is not so safe. White's got pawn weaknesses, but black's structure is not the most beautiful ever. He played queen to f6, which is probably a little bit dubious because my next move, bishop d4, forces a bit of a concession. Because bishop c5 is completely forced now. You can't play queen f5 because, for example, rook e1, piling up on this pawn, and for example, rook d6, and now g4. And white's just crashing through because of, well, the exposed position of black's king. You can't take on f4, for example, just rook f1. In addition to taking on e6s, all this stuff. So bishop c5, bishop takes c5, b takes c5. So this bishop's gone, so it's not really going to be taking on a3 at any particular moment. And black structure is equally ugly now, if not more ugly than mine. So white should be a little bit better here. Queen a6 I played, rook c7, and here I played rook takes d8. And after the game, my opponent pointed out the move queen to a5, which I'd missed, which is a nice move because a bunch of black's bits are hit, and it's a bit awkward to defend them. It seems that black's, if you check it with a computer, black's still doing more or less okay, but it looks like white should at least be able to pick up one of these pawns and then make some sort of attempt to press for a little bit, and probably shouldn't lose the game. But instead I played rook takes d8, because, yeah, again, by this point I don't think I had very much time left. So, because I'd spent all this time weighing knight takes f7, you know, I don't have time to weigh rook takes d8 versus noticing queen a5 or something. Rook d8, queen d8, and rook e1. Bishop d5. And now here what I've written in the notes here is, and here's where things start to go south, and boy do they ever go south. I blame this in part on the fact that I didn't have much clock time left by this point, as I'd burned a lot of it contemplating 20 knight takes f7, and the ramifications of a sacrifice it turned out that black had barely thought about accepting. And yeah, I go on to say some stuff about, well, I'm all for looking at interesting things. At some point you have to be pragmatic. Anyway, all this to say that I made a bad move here. White should take on d5, or play queen e2, I suppose, but I think taking on d5 is the most accurate move here. But I played rook d1, which is silly. Yeah. I don't know. I guess psychologically you could make the case that I'm still in the mindset of I've just played knight takes f7. I'm still trying to attack. I just went queen a6, rook d1, and I'd still like to attack the weakened d6 point. I'm making a pin here. But I just missed black's next move, c4. And, yeah. Taking on c4 just loses a piece after black recaptures with the bishop. And white's queen is hit on a6. So, yeah. This, I think white really shouldn't allow. Queen b5, queen d6. And now again, still trying to exploit the black king being on f7. In reality, white should, decide, okay, now I'm worse. I'm going to try to defend for a bit. And the position is really not too bad. And if white goes, defends well, he should still be able to hold it. But still in an optimistic mood, but with not particularly any clock time to back up my optimism, I played queen b8 with the idea of playing queen h8 and generating some counterplay against the black king. But this doesn't work. I just missed queen b6 check. Queen takes b6, a b6. And now, if black's not winning, he's close to winning, because white's queenside pawns are very weak. Black has improved his structure, very importantly. Neither of these pawns are particularly weak, whereas the one on a3 and then later on the one on c3 are extremely weak. And now that the queens are off the board, black's king is no longer a source of weakness. So white should lose this position, and I did lose the position. After putting up some fairly pathetic defense, I eventually resigned on move 45. But yeah, I thought that game was sort of interesting as another example of this whole, getting too interested in a position. And this position, and more specifically, this position, I was way too interested in figuring out what was going on here. Which is interesting, like, if you're analyzing after the game with your opponent, this is an interesting position to analyze with someone, but in the game, it's in a tournament game, it's not always so pragmatic to spend so much time looking at this. And yeah, okay. That's all I have for now, and see ya.